The encounter at JFK. Alice Johnson had never considered herself an overly flashy person, though she was undeniably successful. Her rise to the top had been marked by a relentless work ethic, a sharp mind, and a commitment to excellence. She was the CEO of a leading tech firm, a position she had earned after years of overcoming challenges that often came with being a black woman in a predominantly white industry. But as she walked into the bustling JFK terminal, dressed in her signature sharp gray suit, she wasn't thinking about any of that. She had a flight to catch, a pivotal flight to Los Angeles, where she was scheduled to meet with potential investors for a deal that could make or break her company. It was early, and the airport was already filled with the usual hum of travelers. Alice moved swiftly through the crowd, her mind focused on the meeting ahead. She had prepared for months, pouring every ounce of her energy into perfecting her pitch. This was her moment to secure a billion-dollar contract that would take her business to the next level, and she wasn't going to let anything distract her. As she approached the check-in counter for Zenith Airlines, Alice noticed the young employee standing behind the desk. He was a tall, lanky man with dark hair and a nervous smile. She greeted him with a nod, her tone professional but warm. "Good morning. I'd like to request an upgrade to business class, please," she said, placing her ticket on the counter. The employee, whose name tag read Michael, glanced down at her ticket, then back up at her. There was a brief hesitation before he spoke. "I'm afraid there are no available seats in business class," Michael replied, his voice somewhat strained, as though he were reading from a script. "But I can check you in for economy." Alice raised an eyebrow, noting the polite but dismissive tone in his voice. She had flown with Zenith Airlines many times before, and her status with the airline's frequent flyer program should have more than qualified her for an upgrade. "I'm eligible for an upgrade based on my loyalty status," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Could you double-check? I believe there should be a seat available for me." Michael hesitated, his fingers typing something into the computer. Alice could see him glancing back and forth between the screen and her. There was a sense of discomfort in his posture, as if he was unsure of how to handle the situation. After a moment, he looked back up at Alice, his smile a little more strained than before. "I'm sorry, ma'am. It seems like we've already allocated all our upgrades for the day." Alice's mind raced. She knew the system. She knew her status was more than enough to qualify for an upgrade. But rather than making a scene, she decided to approach the situation with calm professionalism. She didn't want to cause any trouble. She was too focused on the business meeting ahead, and this was just a minor inconvenience, or so she thought. "Could you explain why I've been denied, Michael? Is there a mistake in the system? I've flown this route dozens of times, and I'm always upgraded based on my loyalty." Michael blinked, clearly uncomfortable with her question. There was a long pause before he responded. I don't know what to tell you, ma'am. We're just following protocol." Alice frowned, but before she could respond, she noticed a man standing behind her, someone who had entered the line after her. He was wearing a trendy, sporty jacket and had the air of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. Alice didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about his confident posture. To her astonishment, Michael, who had barely given her a second glance, suddenly became more animated. He turned to the man behind her, his demeanor shifting dramatically. "Good morning, sir. It looks like there's an upgrade available for you to business class today," Michael said, his tone suddenly warm and enthusiastic. The man in the sporty jacket grinned and accepted the business class ticket without a moment's hesitation. Alice blinked, feeling a sudden rush of heat in her chest. "Excuse me," Alice interjected, her voice calm but firm. "I was ahead of him in line, and I've been denied an upgrade. How is it that he's receiving one?" Michael glanced at her, his expression faltering. He seemed taken aback by her question, his eyes darting nervously between her and the man who was now walking away toward the security line. "Ma'am, like I said, we only grant upgrades to passengers who, better match the expectations of our airline," Michael muttered, as though struggling to find the right words. Alice felt her pulse quicken. The implication hung heavy in the air. She had been denied for reasons that seemed far more arbitrary than the so-called protocol Michael had mentioned. The tension in the air between them was palpable. "Match the expectations of your airline," Alice echoed, her voice cool but cutting. "Could you explain what that means? I believe I meet every expectation for an upgrade. I've been loyal to Zenith Airlines for years." For a moment, Michael opened his mouth, then closed it again, seemingly unsure of how to respond. It was clear that his hesitation wasn't just about his lack of authority, but something deeper. Something about Alice's presence made him uneasy, or perhaps it was the look she was giving him, one that didn't miss a single detail. The man who had received the upgrade was already out of earshot, and Alice's patience was running thin. She wasn't the kind of person to let things slide, not when it came to principles like fairness and equality. "I'll need to speak with your supervisor," Alice said firmly, the decision made. "Now." Michael's face reddened, and he quickly glanced around, his nerves clearly fraying. I'll have someone come speak with you," he stammered, stepping away from the desk and disappearing into the back office. Alice stood there, her mind swirling. It was just a seat, but the feeling she had experienced wasn't just about the upgrade. It was about being dismissed, about having to prove her worth simply because of the color of her skin. And she had had enough. As the minutes ticked by, Alice's frustration grew. It wasn't just about being denied a business-class seat. It was about the unfairness that so often accompanied her success. The countless times she had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, simply because she didn't fit the mold of what people expected a CEO to look like. But she wasn't the kind of woman to back down in the face of adversity. No matter the challenge, Alice always pressed forward, her resolve growing stronger with each obstacle. This time, however, she wasn't going to let this pass without making her voice heard. Finally, a manager approached the desk. The man, in his late 40s, wore a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, his voice smooth but lacking sincerity. "I understand there's an issue with your seat upgrade." Alice didn't mince words. "Yes, there is," she replied sharply. "I've been denied an upgrade despite my loyalty status, and I just watched as another passenger, who was behind me, was granted one without any explanation." The manager's smile faltered. He glanced at Michael, who was standing in the background, and then back at Alice. "We try our best to accommodate all our passengers," he said diplomatically, though it was clear he wasn't fully prepared for the confrontation. Alice's eyes narrowed. "It's not about accommodation. It's about discrimination. And I'm not going to let this go." And just like that, the stage was set. What Alice hadn't yet realized was that her quiet stand against this seemingly small injustice would snowball into something far larger than she could have imagined. The unfolding consequences. As Alice Johnson sat back in the uncomfortable economy seat of her flight to Los Angeles, the world outside the plane's windows blurred in a swirl of city lights and fading twilight. Her mind, however, was anything but calm. She stared out into the darkness of the night sky, replaying the events at JFK over and over in her head, trying to make sense of the denial she had faced. The words Michael had spoken kept echoing in her mind. "We grant upgrades to passengers who better match the expectations of our airline." What did that even mean? It was clear, in that moment, that there had been no logical explanation for the snub. She had been ahead in line. She was a frequent flyer, and she had more than earned the upgrade through her loyalty to Zenith Airlines. But something about her, something about the way she carried herself, had made Michael, and by extension the airline, decide she didn't match their expectations. And that thought, the realization of being judged not on merit, but on an invisible biased scale, stung more than she cared to admit. It was as though she was forced to carry the weight of every past slight, every racist incident that had come her way, all over again. Alice's mind drifted to her upbringing. Raised in a modest neighborhood, She had seen firsthand how opportunities were often just out of reach for people like her. She had fought tooth and nail to get where she was. Through sleepless nights, relentless determination, and a belief that if she worked harder than anyone else, she could break through the barriers that had been built around her. But moments like these, the subtle, almost imperceptible forms of discrimination, reminded her that no matter how much success she accumulated, no matter how many titles she held, she would always have to prove herself to others. She wasn't naive. She knew how the world worked. But that didn't make the sting of injustice any less sharp. As the plane ascended, Alice's thoughts were interrupted by a soft ding from the overhead speaker. The flight attendants had begun their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. Alice accepted a glass of water, taking a small sip to steady her nerves. But her mind was still racing. She knew that if she let this pass without doing something about it, nothing would change. The experience would be just another chapter in her long history of confronting inequities in the workplace and beyond. But she was tired of always being the bigger person, tired of letting things slide for the sake of peace, tired of being expected to quietly accept the inequities that others didn't have to face. Alice wasn't one to back down. She had fought too long and hard for what she had. But more than that, she had learned that sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't just about you. It was about everyone who had been treated unfairly, who had been overlooked, or disregarded simply because they didn't fit a mold. She realized that her actions in the coming hours could have an impact far beyond this flight, far beyond this one moment. It was time to make a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized or overlooked. The hours on the plane passed in a blur, and Alice's thoughts never stopped swirling. She couldn't let go of the feeling of having been treated differently, of the stark contrast between how she was handled and how the man behind her had been treated. When the plane finally touched down in Los Angeles, Alice knew she couldn't let this incident go. She needed to make her voice heard. The first step. The moment she stepped off the plane, Alice's phone buzzed in her hand. The familiar tone of an incoming message breaking her focus. It was a text from her assistant, Naomi. Just confirming that your meeting with the investors is set for 10 a.m. tomorrow. Everything looks good on our end. You're going to kill it. Just remember to take a deep breath and enjoy the moment. Alice smiled at the message. Naomi had been with her from the very beginning. In fact, Naomi had been one of the first people who had believed in Alice when no one else did. She was the one person who always had Alice's back, and the one person who reminded her to stay grounded when things got overwhelming. It was Naomi who had kept her sane during the grueling years of building the company. Still, Alice couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She knew what was waiting for her. This investor meeting was huge, and her focus needed to be on sealing the deal. But she also knew that if she didn't take action now, the injustice at the airport would hang over her, clouding her ability to think clearly. Alice was determined to take a stand, but she also knew that timing was everything. She couldn't afford to let her emotions get the best of her in the midst of such an important meeting. So after a deep breath, she composed herself and decided to focus on her meeting first. The investor meeting. The next morning, Alice walked into the sleek, modern conference room where the investors were waiting. Her heels clicked confidently on the marble floor as she took her seat at the head of the table. She was prepared. Her mind was sharp, and the presentation she had crafted was flawless. But there was a part of her that couldn't shake the sense of injustice still simmering beneath her calm exterior. As the meeting began, Alice launched into her pitch, her voice steady and clear. She had spent countless hours preparing for this, and she wasn't going to let anything distract her. The investors were attentive, asking insightful questions, and Alice answered each one with the precision of a seasoned CEO. However, as the discussion shifted to the terms of the deal, one of the investors, a tall man in a crisp suit named William, asked a question that made Alice's heart skip a beat. "Alice," William began, "I'm impressed with the numbers and the vision. But let me ask you this. How do you plan to manage the diversity of your workforce? We've seen in the past how diversity initiatives have a direct impact on growth, especially in today's market. What steps have you taken to ensure your company reflects that? Alice was taken aback for a moment. She had expected questions about market share, competition, or future projections, not about diversity. Still, she kept her cool. Diversity has always been a core value of my company, Alice replied, her voice unwavering. Our mission is to create products that serve everyone, not just a specific demographic. And to do that, we need diverse perspectives at every level. We've implemented mentorship programs, hiring initiatives focused on underrepresented groups, and we provide resources to ensure that all of our employees, regardless of background, have equal opportunities for advancement. It's part of the culture we've built here. William nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. Alice couldn't help but wonder if he was truly listening, or if he was simply checking off boxes in his mind. But then something unexpected happened. Another investor, a woman named Laura, spoke up. I've been following your company's growth, Alice, and I have to say I'm impressed by the culture you've cultivated. I'm actually in the middle of an initiative at my own company to increase diversity in our hiring processes, and I think we could learn a lot from your approach. Alice's heart skipped. Laura's words felt like a breath of fresh air in the midst of a tension-filled meeting. Thank you, Laura, Alice said, smiling. I'd be happy to share more about our initiatives after the meeting. The conversation shifted, and for the rest of the meeting, Alice was able to focus on the matter at hand. The investors were impressed with her pitch, and by the time the meeting ended, Alice had successfully secured the deal. But even as she celebrated her success, her mind couldn't shake the events at the airport. She knew this victory wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. There were larger issues at play, and she had to do something about it. She would need to confront the airline, not just for herself, but for every other person who had ever been treated unfairly. And so, Alice's journey was far from over. What began as a simple act of discrimination would soon ignite a chain of events that would challenge the very fabric of society and forever change the way the world viewed privilege and equality. The ripple effect. The deal had been secured. Alice sat in the back of a sleek black car, staring out the window at the sprawling Los Angeles skyline as the vehicle glided smoothly through the streets. The city's golden hues were beginning to fade as the evening approached, casting a warm glow across the buildings. But despite the triumph she had just experienced, securing the multi-billion-dollar contract for her company, her mind was far from at ease. The events at JFK still weighed heavily on her, pulling her thoughts back to that moment. How had she been treated so differently? How had a simple request for an upgrade been denied on what appeared to be the basis of nothing more than bias? The injustice was not only frustrating, it was infuriating. But what truly bothered Alice was how routine this sort of treatment seemed. She had lived through it countless times in her career. The subtle dismissals, the dismissive attitudes, the microaggressions that came in various forms. But this felt different. It wasn't just a personal affront. It was a system-wide issue. The airline had judged her based on an invisible, unfair standard that had little to do with who she was as a person, and everything to do with preconceived notions about what people like her deserved. And Alice wasn't willing to let this one go. She knew it would take more than a conversation with a manager to change things. It would take action. Real, systemic change. And for that, she would have to put everything on the line. The call to action. After the meeting, Alice went back to her hotel room, exhausted but restless. Her phone buzzed with notifications, congratulations from her team, messages of support from Naomi, and a few news alerts covering the investor deal. But none of it brought her peace. Alice needed to act, and she knew it couldn't wait. She took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Hello, Alice," the voice on the other end answered, warm and familiar. "What's on your mind?" It was Miriam, a civil rights lawyer, and one of Alice's closest friends. The two of them had crossed paths during Alice's early days as an entrepreneur, when she was still trying to find her footing. Miriam had been a mentor, offering advice not just on legal matters, but on how to navigate the often treacherous waters of being a woman of color in the business world. Miriam had fought tirelessly for justice and equality, and Alice knew she could count on her for support when things got tough. "Miriam, I need your help," Alice said, her voice calm but urgent. "I was just treated unfairly by an airline, and I'm not going to let it slide." There was a brief silence on the other end before Miriam responded. "Tell me what happened." Alice recounted the events at JFK, the denial of her upgrade, the dismissive treatment from Michael, and the clear discrimination that had been at play. Miriam listened intently, asking questions and taking notes, before offering her advice. "Okay, here's what I think," Miriam said. "You've got a couple of options. First, we can send a letter to the airline's corporate office, outlining your experience and demanding an apology. That might get their attention, but it's likely to be a quick fix, a little PR exercise. Second, we could take a more public approach. You could file a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation for discrimination. Or, Alice interrupted. Miriam continued, you could take this to the press. Expose the way this airline, and companies like it, perpetuate systemic racism and discrimination. Bring the story to light. Make them accountable." Alice paused, thinking. The thought of going public was daunting. She had built her career on professionalism and credibility, but she knew the cost of staying silent. She had seen far too many stories of black people, particularly women, being silenced by powerful institutions. This wasn't just her fight. This was bigger than her. "I'm in," Alice said, her voice firm. "I'm ready to go public with this, but we do it strategically. I want to hit them where it hurts. Let's get the media involved, but we need to make sure we have all the facts lined up first." Miriam agreed, and they quickly made a plan to proceed. Over the next few hours, Alice and Miriam worked together to draft a statement outlining Alice's experience, preparing a legal response, and getting in touch with key journalists who had covered similar stories. Alice knew that this was only the beginning, but she was prepared to see it through. The media storm. The very next day, a story began to circulate. It was a quiet start. An anonymous tip to a reporter at a major news outlet. The headline was simple, yet provocative. CEO denied upgrade by airline. The unseen discrimination in the travel industry. The article quickly gained traction as more details emerged about Alice's encounter at JFK. It wasn't just about one person's experience. It was about an underlying culture of bias and inequality that many had long suspected, but few had dared to speak out against. As the story spread, it began to resonate with people across the country, especially those who had experienced similar treatment while traveling. But the response was not entirely positive. Zenith Airlines, now thrust into the spotlight, issued a statement defending their actions, claiming that the upgrade decision had been made purely based on availability and had nothing to do with race. They expressed regret that Alice had felt mistreated, but emphasized that the incident was a result of a misunderstanding. Alice, however, was undeterred. "It's not a misunderstanding," she said during an interview with a major news outlet. "It's a pattern of discrimination that runs deep in the way this industry, and many others, operate. This isn't just about one upgrade on one flight. It's about how people like me are constantly told that we don't fit the expectations of those in power, that our success is somehow lesser than others simply because of our skin color." The media coverage only grew from there, with more stories of individuals coming forward to share their own experiences of being denied upgrades, mistreated, or even overlooked based on their appearance or perceived status. The hashtag upgrade equality began trending, with people from all walks of life expressing their solidarity and frustration. Alice was overwhelmed by the response. Messages of support poured in from across the country. people of all backgrounds, many of whom had never thought twice about the subtle forms of discrimination that had shaped their own experiences. Alice was no longer just a CEO in a gray suit. She had become a voice for an issue that had been quietly simmering for decades. The meeting with Zenith executives. Several weeks after the public outcry, Alice received a formal invitation from Zenith Airlines to meet with their executive team. The airline, under intense pressure, had finally agreed to sit down with her and discuss the next steps. This wasn't a moment Alice had expected to come easily. After all, they had tried to sweep the issue under the rug in the beginning, with a generic apology and some empty promises. But now, with mounting public scrutiny, they were ready to negotiate. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Alice arrived at the Zenith corporate headquarters in New York with Miriam by her side. The company had chosen a large conference room, the kind that could hold dozens of high-ranking executives, but the space felt eerily sterile. Alice sat at the head of the table, flanked by her lawyer and a communications strategist, ready to engage in what promised to be a tense discussion. The room was filled with the hum of low conversation as Zenith's executives filed in. Alice recognized a few of them from the media coverage, particularly the CEO, Robert Hayes, who had issued the airline's initial apology. He looked tired, his face drawn with stress, but his eyes never left Alice as he made his way to the head of the table. "Alice," Hayes said, offering a thin smile as he extended his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us today." Alice didn't reach out immediately. Instead, she took a moment to look him in the eye, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before she shook his hand. "I think you owe me more than just a handshake," she replied, her voice steady and calm. "And you owe the public much more than the apology you offered." Hayes nodded, his posture stiffening. "I understand your frustration, and we acknowledge that we failed in addressing the situation appropriately. But we're here to discuss how we can move forward together." Alice didn't waste time with pleasantries. She came prepared. "First, I want to be clear about something," she began, pulling a folder of documents from her briefcase. "This isn't just about one incident or one person. This is about how your company, and many others, have allowed a culture of bias to thrive unchecked. This is about the systemic issues that have plagued the travel industry for years. You may not have realized it at the time, but that moment at JFK wasn't just an isolated mistake. It's part of a larger pattern that needs to be addressed." The executives exchanged uneasy glances, and Alice could see that they weren't fully prepared for the directness of her approach. She wasn't here for a token apology or a nice soundbite. She was here to make them listen. "We understand that the perception of unequal treatment is a serious issue," Hayes replied carefully. "That's why we've already started reviewing our internal procedures. We're planning to roll out new training programs for our employees and make sure that incidents like this don't happen again." Alice didn't let him off the hook so easily. Training programs are a start, but they're not enough. You can't just throw money at the problem and expect it to go away. What are you going to do to address the deep-seated bias that exists in your company culture? What steps will you take to ensure real diversity in hiring, not just at the entry level, but in leadership positions? Because that's where the change really needs to happen. There was a moment of silence in the room. Miriam, seated beside Alice, shot a pointed look at the executives, daring them to argue. "We're committed to diversifying our leadership teams," Hayes said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "And we understand that there's work to be done, but we want to make sure we approach this in a way that doesn't alienate our current employees or cause any further divisions." Alice leaned forward, her voice low but commanding. "No one is asking you to tear the company down. What we're asking for is transparency, accountability, and action. If you're serious about making a difference, then you'll back up your words with concrete steps. You'll open up your records and show us that you're making real progress. And you'll publicly commit to making diversity and inclusion a core part of your brand moving forward." The fallout. Zenith Airlines, already under fire from the press, faced mounting pressure. Public opinion was turning against them, and the airline's executives began to realize the magnitude of the problem. What had started as an isolated incident was now a full-blown PR crisis. They could no longer hide behind vague statements or feign ignorance. Behind the scenes, Alice and Miriam were pushing hard. Miriam was working with legal experts to file complaints with government agencies, while Alice was making calls to business leaders, urging them to stand with her in the fight for equality. It wasn't long before Zenith Airlines made an unprecedented move. They issued a public apology to Alice, admitting that the company's actions had fallen short of the standards they prided themselves on. They'd promised to conduct an internal review and implement new diversity and sensitivity training for all staff. But Alice knew this was just the beginning. "I don't want just an apology," Alice said in a follow-up statement. "I want real change. I want to see this airline, and every other company, take concrete steps to address the systemic racism that exists in their organizations, and I'm not stopping until I see it happen." As the weeks passed, Alice's fight began to snowball. What started as one woman's call for fairness had turned into a nationwide movement, a call for accountability in the corporate world. Alice wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. And she wasn't about to back down. The winds of change. In the weeks that followed Alice Johnson's public stand against Zenith Airlines, the ripple effect of her actions began to shift the cultural landscape. What had started as a personal confrontation over an unfairly denied seat in business class had snowballed into a full-fledged movement for justice, accountability, and corporate responsibility. Alice was now at the center of a national conversation about racism in the travel industry and beyond. Her phone rang constantly, each call representing a new opportunity or a new challenge. The media coverage surrounding her story had only intensified, and more people were reaching out to share their own experiences of discrimination. Social media platforms, once flooded with messages of anger and confusion, were now buzzing with solidarity. The hashtag Upgrade Equality had become a symbol of resistance, representing the fight against systemic bias in industries that were supposed to serve everyone equally, regardless of race or background. The pressure mounts. Zenith Airlines, meanwhile, found itself in a precarious position. The company's initial apology had done little to quell the backlash. In fact, it had only exposed the glaring gaps in their diversity practices and revealed the depth of the company's reluctance to engage meaningfully with the issue. Public trust was eroding, and consumer boycotts were being organized. The media coverage had transitioned from critical to relentless. Alice knew she had the upper hand, but she wasn't interested in playing games. This wasn't about winning a public relations battle. It was about forcing real, structural change. She was determined to leverage this moment to put pressure on Zenith, and more broadly, to push for a cultural shift across corporate America. Her assistant Naomi had been with her every step of the way, managing her calendar and arranging interviews with influential outlets. But even Naomi, always calm and composed, couldn't help but express concern one evening when Alice arrived at her office. "Alice, you've been on nonstop calls for weeks. Don't you think it might be time to take a break? Maybe go home for a few days. You're looking exhausted." Naomi's voice was gentle, but there was an underlying urgency to it. Alice paused, rubbing her temples. "I hear you, Naomi. I really do. But this is bigger than me now. If I stop, even for a second, I'll lose momentum. This has to keep moving forward. This is about creating lasting change." Naomi hesitated, then nodded. "I understand. But just remember, you don't have to carry this burden alone." Alice smiled faintly. "I know, but I'm not doing this just for me. I'm doing this for all of us. For everyone who's been silenced or overlooked." It was that deep, unyielding sense of responsibility that kept Alice pushing forward, even when the weight of the media spotlight, the demands of her business, and the constant barrage of calls from advocates and critics alike began to take its toll. She knew she was fighting for something much larger than herself, and that knowledge fueled her determination. The conversation went on for hours, the back and forth intensifying as Alice pressed them on every issue. By the time the meeting concluded, there was a sense of reluctant agreement in the air. Zenith Airlines promised to implement a series of reforms, expanding their diversity initiatives, introducing regular audits of their hiring and promotion practices, and creating a public accountability framework that would allow customers to see the progress the company was making. But Alice knew this was only the beginning. It was a first step, but it would take sustained pressure to ensure the company followed through. The growing movement. By the time Alice returned to her hotel later that evening, the press had already picked up on the details of the meeting. Headlines flashed across her phone, and social media exploded with reactions. Some supported her decision to hold Zenith accountable, while others questioned her approach. But one thing was clear: Alice had forced the conversation into the mainstream. Zenith Airlines' efforts to mitigate the fallout were now being closely watched, not just by the media, but by the public. Alice had become a symbol of resilience, and the fight for equality had taken on a life of its own. Her story was no longer just about a single incident of discrimination. It had become a battle cry for anyone who had ever felt overlooked or undervalued. Alice knew there would be more challenges ahead. The road to change was long and winding, and the forces of resistance would not go down without a fight. But she was ready for whatever came next. The winds of change had begun to blow, and Alice was determined to ride them all the way to the top. The battle intensifies. Alice Johnson's actions had ignited a firestorm, and the days that followed her meeting with Zenith Airlines only fueled the growing sense of urgency and change. What had started as a personal fight against an unfair airline policy had now turned into a high-profile battle for justice, one that transcended corporate interests and touched on deeper societal issues of race, class, and power. Zenith Airlines had been forced to walk a tightrope. Their public relations department scrambled to craft the next move, releasing statements in response to the growing backlash, but the damage was already done. The public wasn't just upset by the incident at JFK. It was the pattern of unequal treatment, the silent perpetuation of biases within corporate systems that had now come under scrutiny. Alice had exposed something that was both personal and systemic, and she wasn't about to let them off the hook with a few empty promises. But for Alice, the fight had become far bigger than a single company. It was about corporate America as a whole, and the ways in which institutions, whether intentional or not, created environments that were not inclusive of people like her. As she returned to her office in New York, her thoughts were occupied with the next steps. The path ahead wasn't just about securing a new policy at Zenith Airlines. It was about challenging the very frameworks that allowed such inequities to exist in the first place. Mobilizing allies. It was a late afternoon when Alice received a call from an unlikely source. Lisa Carter, the CEO of a major tech startup and a former adversary in the business world. Alice and Lisa had never been close, often competing in the same circles for investment and resources, but that was before the airline incident. Now, their relationship had taken on a new tone. "Hello, Alice. I've been watching what's been happening, and I wanted to reach out," Lisa said, her voice filled with sincerity. "What you're doing is changing the narrative for all of us, and I want to help. I've got some resources and connections that might be useful in pushing this even further." Alice was taken aback by the offer. Lisa was a formidable force in the tech world, known for her sharp business acumen, but also for her often unyielding competitiveness. They had clashed at board meetings, each vying for the spotlight in the corporate world. But now, Lisa was speaking with a different urgency, a different commitment. "Thank you," Alice responded, her voice steady but thoughtful. "I appreciate it. I spent most of my career trying to make space for women and people of color in industries that have largely ignored us. But this is different. It's not just about getting more black women into leadership roles. It's about changing how companies think about us and the people who come after us." Lisa paused. "I agree. And that's why I think it's time we take this fight beyond the individual companies. We need a collective movement, a coalition of executives, activists, and everyday people who are willing to push for systemic change in corporate culture. Not just diversity training, real accountability. Alice leaned back in her chair, absorbing Lisa's words. It was the kind of big, bold idea Alice had been looking for. She knew the importance of alliances in this fight. Alone, she could have exposed one airline, but together, they could change the way entire industries operated. Over the next week, Alice, Lisa, and a handful of other executives and activists, including Miriam, worked behind the scenes to craft a plan. The idea was simple but ambitious: to create a coalition of companies and individuals committed to radically changing how businesses engaged with issues of race, equity, and inclusion. They would not just issue statements or hold training sessions. They would push for real metrics, hiring quotas, public reporting, and policies that would force companies to take action, not just talk about it. The group, which began to call itself the Inclusive Leaders Coalition, ILC, started with just a few high-profile names, but word quickly spread. Alice reached out to key figures in different industries: tech, entertainment, fashion, and finance. Each person she spoke to had their own story of discrimination or bias, and each was ready to contribute their influence and resources to the cause. By the end of the month, Alice had secured commitments from major companies to join the ILC. The coalition was small at first, but its message was powerful. Companies had to do more than just fill quotas. They had to ensure that diversity and inclusion were embedded in their cultures, from the boardroom to the factory floor. Zenith Airlines faces new scrutiny. As Alice's efforts with the ILC grew, Zenith Airlines found itself under even more intense scrutiny. The airline's executives, who had once hoped the scandal would blow over, now realized that their initial response had only made things worse. In the months since Alice's public call for accountability, the airline had been embroiled in lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and a severe loss of customer trust. Alice, however, wasn't focused solely on Zenith's troubles. She knew that bringing one company to task was only the beginning. Her ultimate goal was to create a system of accountability that would apply to every company in every industry. And the media attention was relentless. Alice had become something of a media darling, invited to speak at conferences, interviewed by top journalists, and quoted in publications ranging from the New York Times to Forbes. Her every move was being watched closely, and she was aware of the weight that came with the spotlight. The public was watching, and if she faltered, they would seize on her mistakes. But Alice was determined. She had already survived so much, and the thought of backing down was never an option. One morning, Alice received an unexpected call from Robert Hayes, the CEO of Zenith Airlines. The company had made a decision that would affect not just the airline, but the industry at large. "Alice," Robert began, his tone more serious than she had ever heard it before, "I want to let you know that Zenith Airlines is ready to make a historic commitment. After reviewing everything you've brought to light, we've realized that we can't just change a few policies and expect things to improve. We need to restructure from the inside out." Alice was taken aback. "What are you saying?" "We're committing to becoming a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just for our employees, but for our customers. We'll be implementing mandatory quotas for diversity at all levels of the company, starting with the executive team. We'll also create an independent board to monitor progress, and we'll start publishing quarterly diversity reports. But most importantly, we'll stop hiding behind PR statements. We're ready to be fully transparent." Alice's mind raced as she processed the words. She had fought hard for this moment, but hearing it actually happening was surreal. Zenith Airlines, one of the largest airlines in the world, was making a public commitment to change, and Alice had played a pivotal role in making it happen. "I'm glad to hear it," Alice said carefully. "But don't mistake this for the end of the journey. This is just the beginning. Now you need to follow through, and we'll all be watching." The broader impact. As Zenith Airlines began its public reformation, The impact of Alice's efforts began to be felt on a larger scale. The Inclusive Leaders Coalition's influence grew, and soon, companies that had once been hesitant to engage with the movement began to reach out. Alice was invited to sit on the boards of several prominent organizations that were now prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet, as the spotlight intensified, Alice's resolve only grew stronger. She continued to speak out on issues of corporate responsibility, using her platform to advocate for women and people of color in all industries. Her journey wasn't just about calling out discrimination when she saw it. It was about reshaping entire systems to ensure that everyone, regardless of background, had an equal opportunity to succeed. Through it all, Alice remained grounded in the core belief that change wasn't something to wait for, it was something to create. The battle was far from over, but she had no intention of backing down. Alice Johnson had become a force for progress, and she was just getting started. The legacy of change. The dust had settled in the corporate world after the initial wave of Alice Johnson's confrontation with Zenith Airlines, but the echoes of her actions reverberated far beyond the confines of the travel industry. What started as a fight over a business-class seat had transformed into a revolution of sorts, a shift in how the world viewed corporate responsibility, diversity, and inclusion. Alice had not only forced a massive corporation to reckon with its own biases, but she had also ignited a movement that transcended industries and had the potential to reshape the future of corporate America. As the months passed, Alice's life began to take on a new rhythm. The intense media cycle had died down, but her mission was far from complete. Now, more than ever, she knew that true change would require more than just one company taking action. It would require an entire ecosystem of businesses, policymakers, and everyday people coming together to create a culture that didn't just tolerate diversity, but actively championed it. A new kind of leadership. Alice had always been a leader in her field, but now she was stepping into a role she hadn't quite anticipated. The media and the public no longer saw her as just a successful businesswoman or a savvy investor. They saw her as a symbol of resistance, of fighting back against a system that had long been stacked against people like her. She had received countless invitations to speak at conferences, panels, and industry events. Everywhere she went, people wanted to know how she had taken on one of the biggest airlines in the world. And won. But Alice knew that her journey was about more than just telling her story. It was about using the power of her platform to push for systemic change. One such event was a national summit on corporate diversity and inclusion, organized by the Inclusive Leaders Coalition, ILC, the organization she had helped build with the help of Lisa Carter and other business leaders. This summit was not just another talking shop. It was designed to bring together executives, entrepreneurs, advocates, and policymakers to establish actionable goals and measurable results. It was Alice's chance to take her fight to the next level, and she wasn't going to waste it. The event was held in Washington, D.C., and Alice had been asked to deliver the keynote address. She stood backstage, staring at the sea of faces in the audience. Business leaders, activists, lawmakers, journalists. They were all here, waiting for her to speak. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. She took a deep breath, straightened her jacket, and stepped onto the stage. The applause was thunderous, and Alice couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. But she knew that the applause was for the movement she had helped ignite, not just for her. "Thank you all for being here today," Alice began, her voice steady and resolute. "I stand before you not as an individual, but as a representative of something much bigger than myself. A movement that is not about one woman or one incident or one company. It's about a revolution in how we see ourselves and how we see others. It's about recognizing that true leadership means standing up for those who've been overlooked, ignored, or silenced for far too long." She paused, letting the words sink in. For years, we've heard about the importance of diversity. We've seen the slogans, the diversity training programs, the corporate commitments. But how many of these companies have actually followed through? How many of them are willing to put their money where their mouth is? How many of them are truly committed to not just hiring diverse talent, but empowering them, supporting them, and creating an environment where they can thrive? The audience was silent now, hanging on her every word. The truth is, real change isn't going to come from ticking boxes or issuing press releases. It's going to come from looking at the systems and structures that have been built to keep certain people at the top and others at the bottom, and dismantling them. Alice paused again, letting the gravity of her words settle. I've been lucky in many ways. I've had access to resources, to opportunities, to education, and to a network that has helped me succeed. But I'm not here because I'm exceptional. I'm here because I'm just like many of you. And if I can break through, then there is no reason why anyone else can't. The ripple effect. The speech at the summit was just one moment in a much larger strategy. Alice had begun working closely with other members of the ILC to develop a blueprint for corporate accountability, a set of principles that companies could adopt to demonstrate their commitment to diversity and inclusion in tangible ways. This wasn't just about hiring more Black people or women. It was about changing the way businesses operated, about shifting the very culture that dictated who had access to opportunities and who didn't. Over the next year, Alice's influence continued to grow. The ILC's influence was undeniable, with more and more companies joining the coalition and committing to the principles Alice had helped lay out. The idea of accountability, once a far-off dream, had now become a mainstream expectation. Alice was now sitting on the boards of several organizations that were at the forefront of corporate diversity efforts, and she had become an advisor to several government entities working to create policies that would make diversity and inclusion a central focus of federal contracting and business regulations. But even as her influence grew, Alice remained focused on her original mission: to change the way corporations, and the people who ran them, fought about race and power. One of the biggest victories came when the ILC was invited to meet with lawmakers in Washington to discuss the need for federal legislation to enforce corporate diversity standards. This was a landmark moment, one that had seemed impossible just a few years before. I never thought I'd be sitting here, talking about policy changes with lawmakers, Alice said, shaking her head in disbelief as she looked around the conference room. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that change doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we create it. We have to demand it. Zenith Airlines and the industry's response. Back at Zenith Airlines, the company had faced a transformation of its own. The reforms Alice had pushed for were already in place, but they weren't without challenges. Despite the public commitment to change, Zenith's leadership struggled to meet the lofty goals they had set. The first year was rocky, with internal pushback and resistance from longtime employees who felt that the changes were threatening their positions or disrupting the status quo. But Alice remained in close communication with Zenith's new leadership team, offering advice, encouragement, and accountability. She knew the road to true change was long, but she also knew it was possible. I've always said that real leadership is about resilience, Alice said during a follow-up conversation with Zenith's CEO, Robert Hayes. You're not going to get everything right overnight, but as long as you stay committed, the changes will come. I get it, Alice, Robert replied, sounding more confident than ever. We're not where we want to be yet, but we're making progress, and I think we're starting to see the value in it, not just in terms of public relations, but in the way it's transforming our company culture from the ground up. A new chapter. Alice's impact on the world was now undeniable. She had fought against injustice, and in doing so, she had become a beacon for others. The Inclusive Leaders Coalition had expanded its reach to other countries, and Alice had become a global ambassador for corporate accountability and social justice. But despite all the success and recognition, Alice remained grounded. She still took time to mentor young women of color in business, to speak at high schools and colleges, and to push for more inclusive policies in her own company. She knew that her work was never truly done. There was always more to be done. More companies to hold accountable, more communities to support, and more individuals to lift up. As Alice looked out at the sunset one evening, standing on the balcony of her penthouse overlooking New York City, she reflected on everything she had achieved. Her journey had been long and filled with challenges, but it had been worth it. She had changed the trajectory of her own life, and in doing so, had helped change the lives of countless others. "I fought hard for this," Alice said softly, almost to herself. "But this isn't about me. This is about all of us. This is about making sure that the future we build is one where no one has to fight alone." The winds of change were still blowing, and Alice Johnson was ready to keep fighting.